but Rachel Durbin is giving the presentation for the Sierra Stream Institute in Nevada City. Jeff Lauder, who's been here, you both have been giving presentations before, he couldn't make it today. Joanna Hill is, raise your hand so everyone knows you. You've been coming for a long time. In fact, the next two presentations are going to be from citizen scientists, citizen monitoring groups, and then following up will be Eric Burris, who works for the State Regional Board, but has been working with watershed groups for many, many years and building some great tools that we're going to see. So, Rachel's going to get us started integrating physical habitat data into bioassessment, a case study up in there. I assume it's on Deer Creek. Yeah, they do a lot of work on Deer Creek. So we're going to welcome her and get started, and I'll go out there and yell at some people to get in. Okay? Come on. Give this a better point.
All right, welcome back from lunch, everybody. Thank you for those of you who brought your lunch with you. I know it's kind of a tight little window today. So also thank you to everybody who did a really great job presenting all the multi-metric indices approaches yesterday. I think that was a really good intro into what I'm going to talk about today. And this is a case study that we did on Deer Creek, which is a tributary of the Yuba River, just about an hour and a half east of here. And we're looking at how we can integrate physical habitat metrics into our bioassessment. Jeff Lauder, who is the first author here, couldn't be here. He's a student at Chico State and is in class today. But if you have any questions that are super specific about methodologies, I'll give you his contact info at the end. So our main objectives are to identify how the patterns in physical habitat variability influence the benthic community. So we want to look at our physical habitat data and see how are they relating to our benthic macroinvertebrates. We want to examine the validity of using these data on their own to identify restoration objectives, and I'll give you an example of that later. And then one of the main things that we're interested in is data validation. And there's two perspectives on that. One, the PHAB data is a big suite of metrics that often can be a little bit subjective. And so we want to see how precise are some of these PHAB data and what might be a little bit redundant metrics that we can eliminate. Also, what is the precision of our citizen science collected data? This is with all volunteers. They're teams of college interns that come and spend the summer with us working on various projects. But we have one team of PHABers who go out and do the PHAB analysis on all of our sites on Deer Creek. So how precise are these data, and is this a good way to be collecting them? So what do we already know? This work was really started based on a presentation that Rafael Mazur gave last year. And so I'm going to show you a few slides from that talk so you guys kind of know what our inspiration was. And we've continued that conversation with him over the last year to see how our case study can inform the bigger perspective of what the state's trying to do with these multi-metric indices. So we know that PHAB metrics are not like biological metrics. Biological metrics typically are a response to stress, but PHAB metrics can either be a measure of stress, like our human influence stressor indicator. They can be a response to stress, like percent algae cover. They can be both response and a measure, like bank stability, or they can be neither, like our slope and bearing metric, but still have a pretty big influence on the biology of the system. We also know that PHAB metrics often respond to stress independently of each other and independently of our biological metrics. So how can we use that knowledge to inform decision making? And we also know that biological metrics typically integrate stressors. So it's not just a linear response to one thing that we're seeing in a system. And what are some of the challenges that we're dealing with here? So this is what Rafael outlined last year and how we've been attempting to work through it with our case study. So we want to develop a conceptual model so that we can identify which of these metrics are actually meaningful, which are telling us things that are useful and reliable. Then develop statistical models based on these reference conditions. We didn't do that yet, but that will be a future step. But we want to know what appropriate expectations or endpoints, as a lot of people identified them yesterday are. Then screen these metrics so that we can see which ones are useful, which ones are responsive, which ones are precise, which ones might be redundant and can be eliminated. And then eventually, we want to work on combining these metrics into one of these multi-metric indices so we can look at things like pHAT, water quality, biology, combine them all together and see how everything is interacting with each other. So in choosing and calculating our metrics, we have a few different types that we've used. So we have these commonly used pHAT metrics from this Environmental Monitoring and Assessment Program. This is what the SWAMP protocol uses. And they include things like substrate size, in-stream habitat, percent cover of flow, riparian vegetation. There's a big suite of metrics that we're going out there and collecting. And this is what our teams of pHabbers are doing every summer. Habitat heterogeneity, as people yesterday explained, is a measure of how complex your habitat is. How many different little microhabitats within a site do you have? And we can look at this by measuring habitat evenness, using a modified Shannon's diversity index. And then we also want to know, outside of our small creek, we have a pretty small watershed. What are some of the landscape scale or watershed scale GIS-derived metrics that can inform this? And so those are things like watershed area, percent urban influence, percent impervious, number of roads, etc. And then we calculated an additional metric that allows us to kind of get an idea of the floodplain around our street. And that's the bankful height to the bankful width variance. We wanted to see how that ratio turns out, and if we have a low ratio number, then we can say that we have a high insight variability in our bank slope. So our floodplain is not uniform across the stream. Now, once we calculated all these metrics, we want to evaluate them to make sure that we're actually using ones that matter. We're evaluating in this particular project specifically for precision and responsiveness. So we want small error with our prediction, and we want low variability among replicates so that we can say these are precise metrics that we can consider reliable. And then for responsiveness, we want to make sure that these are sensitive. Normally this is done with reference versus sample sites, so you can see how does your sample site vary from an optimal street condition. Here we're looking at the variability that's significant in structuring our benefit communities. So we have a pretty specific goal of looking at how our benefit communities are responding to this variable. As opposed to just the inherent variability that's going to happen between seasons or between sites. This is really tough, but it's a pretty important step. So we're focusing primarily on the variability that directly influences the benefit communities. So in order to assess precision, we used a modified signal-noise ratio from Kaufman's EMAP protocol, where we're looking at a couple of different terms. And so this term on the left is our signal. This is our between sample variation. And the term on the right is our noise, or our within sample variation. In this case, we're using pooled variance from repeat visits to the same site in 1 year. That's not really what we do on Deer Creek. We're a small watershed group. We have one crew of people who comes out in the summer and goes to 12 different sites. So we're only going to each site once per year. So we had to calculate noise a little bit differently. So in this case, we're looking at pooled variance from visits to like sites. And so we did a cluster analysis via MRPP, I'll show you the results for that in just a minute, that allowed us to say these particular sites within Deer Creek are similar enough in their physical habitat structure to be called like, and then we can use those visits to the different sites as our repeat visits. Now this isn't as accurate a depiction of noise, but it does create a more discriminatory criteria. So the variation between our like sites is going to be a little bit larger than those of the same site at different visits, but we had our precision criteria reflect that. So we used the signal noise ratio of 2.0 as our cutoff for moderately biased. So here you can see a couple of NMS plots that were sort of before and after this cluster analysis. And if you guys aren't familiar with NMS, just a very, very brief run down here. Basically, it's taking all of our sampling points, throwing them up into multi-dimensional space, and then orienting them on this two-dimensional plot here, where points that are closer together are more similar to each other, and points that are further apart are more different from each other. So when you're looking at the upper left plot here, you can see that we have all of our sites. So we have actually 12 sites right here, and site 1 is the most upstream. Site 18 is one of the most downstream, but this is not actually in a elevational gradient here, so it's a little bit confusing. Don't think of this as elevation for site number. But you can see our sites all fall out on this plot, and then when we conducted an MRPP, we saw that they fall out into 5 pretty distinctive groups. And so we have the headwaters in site 4, which is actually quite a bit downstream, clustering up here. We have many of our lower Deer Creek sites clustering here. Squirrel Creek, which is a tributary of Deer Creek down in the lower elevation, and a couple of the lower elevation sites clustering here. Little Deer Creek, which is a mid-elevation tributary. And then Pioneer Park, which is a site in Little Deer Creek, also mid-elevation. So by identifying these groups via the cluster analysis, we can better define site, and we can have what we're calling multiple visits. Now this is that same ordination, but here we have annotated the axis loadings, and you can see that the main source of variance between stream areas is on axis 1. So we've got total human impacts, overhanging vegetation, artificial structures, tree cover, percent sand and fines, substrate, foul web depth, width, emergent vegetation and boulders, width to depth ratio, and habitat heterogeneity that's contributing to the majority of the variance that you're seeing here. So next we wanted to see which of these variables in PHAB are actually telling us something, and which just have a whole lot of noise, which are so variable between visits and among visits that we can't really use them with any sort of reliability. So I'm not going to list all of them because it actually turned out most of them are not terribly reliable, but I'll just give you an example of a couple and tell you why. So here on the top we have our shrub cover signal to noise ratio by year. And at the bottom, we have percent falls. And the majority of our noisy variables we found were those that are related to estimates of percent cover. And there's a lot of reasons that that could be, but the biggest one probably is in sampler error. What one person calls 30%, another person might call 15%, and another person might call 40%. So this is not the most reliable way with moderately trained volunteers to assess what your cover or percent flow habitat is. These are highly subjective. And there are a variety of ways that we can address these. One of them is maybe with better training. Maybe we just need to spend more time with people really nailing down what these percents look like. For some of them, we have implemented some additional tools that can be a little bit more discrete. Or maybe it's just maintenance of one particular person who's making these estimates so that we're not switching around who is the estimator and ending up with these numbers that are all over the place. We do have a little bit of year-to-year variation. You guys will probably notice the same pattern here, where 2009 falls out with very different results than 2008 or 2010. This could be due to year-to-year variation, and certainly with the percent falls, we could expect differences in flow regime might be contributing to that. This also could be due to the fact that we use student volunteers. They're with us for one summer, and one group could vary quite dramatically from another in how they're estimating things. We also are using this particular data set of 2008, 2009, and 2010 because we have a family level IBI calculated for those years, and we can therefore integrate our PHAB data into that family level IBI and get some interesting results from that. So one of the ways that we're addressing these noisy variables is looking at other variables that are a little bit more discrete, a little bit more precise, that can maybe be used instead of these more noisy variables. And so one of the best examples here is with our percent canopy cover, which is very subjective, that can actually be replaced by densiometer cover. It's telling us the same thing, but with discrete numbers that are less open to interpretation. And so as long as our volunteers are well trained in using a densiometer, we can rely on this more confidently than we can rely on the percent canopy cover. It's a loose correlation, but it is significant. And so in trying to have some variable reduction and a little more confidence, we're inclined to go with the densiometer cover. Now this is just a conceptual model of how we interpreted the PHAB data. So how did we get to the point where we knew which variables to use? And I've walked you through most of these steps already, so I won't belabor this. We did our cluster analysis, defined our groups by noise using this precision screening, and then eliminated all the variables that were too noisy to actually tell us anything. We did redundancy screening by using a correlation matrix. Everything that had a Pearson's R of greater than 0.3 to start was our cutoff. And so we wanted to eliminate those variables that were basically telling us the same thing. Then we ended up with a final suite of variables. We have 13 of them, and I'll show you an ordination of them in just a minute. Then we wanted to check, how does this, with our PHAB data, compare with other types of data? So particularly water quality. And a lot of our analyses that we've done in the past have been, how does water quality affect macroinvertebrates? So can we use them in a combined way, or do we have to look at them separately? So we wanted to do these same steps with the water quality of looking at a cluster analysis. Turns out water quality and PHAB sort out very differently, so we have to look at them separately in our case. So we're going to have physical habitat plus water quality plus those GIS watershed scale metrics. Then we're going to do these non-parametric multiplicative regression niche habitat models, which I'll get to very shortly because I see Jen standing up. And eventually the goal is to integrate all of these tolerances into our IBI, and eventually something that we're calling an IHI, or an index of habitat integrity, but that could be named anything in the future. So again, this is our site clustering by PHAB, just so you have a reminder of that visual. This is how everything clusters by water quality, not at all the same. So we can't say that we can use these things as analogous measurements. Now when we overlay all of our useful metrics, you can see that this is what we're left with. So all of these points are benthic macroinvertebrate communities, sample periods. All of the symbols are our sites. We're looking at everything together because, again, those metrics are responding very differently. So we're left with 13 different metrics from all three of those different categories. So water quality, GIS layers, and physical habitat. Now finally, what we're going to get to are these kind of cool figures. And this is where Jeff can give you all the nuts and bolts of how we came to this picture. But what I can tell you is that this is a niche habitat model showing how a particular family that we've picked out as our indicator families, so doing an indicator species analysis, which shows fidelity to certain sites. So in this case, this is a particular family of stonefly. This axis is the NPMR weight, so the tolerance is sort of similar to a correlation coefficient. And we can see that here, this particular stonefly family is responding in a curvilinear way to physical habitat parameters. So this does all the combinations of variables in every possible way. It spit out millions of combinations. And it tells us that this guy responds to percent fast-moving habitat and total riparian cover. And this is its tolerance, or its weight, over here on the vertical axis. They don't all respond the same. So this one shows a bimodal response to interactions of physical habitat and water quality. If you look at one or the other, you don't see this kind of response. And then others show a unimodal response to either habitat or water quality, but only when you look at them together. If you look at them independently, you don't see a response at all. So basically, this is showing us these systems are incredibly complex, nothing is linear, and most of these organisms are responding pretty interactively to multiple stressors. And any index of benthic integrity, habitat integrity, multi-metric, whatever you want to call it, should try to incorporate these as well. So what do we want to do in the future? We want to integrate these weights into our IBI, and we can do that in a way that I've shown with pretty arbitrary numbers here. We also want to use them as a first step towards a multi-indicator metric or scale. So for this example, if we have percent predators as our metric in the IBI that we're interested in, you weight that by the percent predators response to the physical habitat variability. If you see a decreased IBI, you can say that you have a healthy community as determined by your IBI, but degraded habitat. If you have an increased IBI, you have a healthy community and robust habitat. So this is allowing you to integrate all those different metrics and come up with a more interactive interpretation. So some PHAB metrics can be considered independently. They might be able to help us with some restoration goals, such as riparian vegetation metrics. But we have to interpret these with caution, realizing that there's a lot of interaction going on. So as this picture shows, we might have a shift in shrub cover because we've removed a bunch of invasive species. If we're just measuring percent cover as our success in this, we see decreased cover, great, we hit our goal. However, if we're not considering the biology and the fact that we replace that with some native species, we might not be making the right inference there. Or we might just be missing information. Most of the PHAB metrics that we look at have to be interpreted with respect to other metrics, particularly biology and the water quality, so that we don't miss these interactions. And then just one very quick example of how we might use this in restoration, because that's a lot of what we do with Sierra streams, is if we have two species of benthic macroinvertebrates. Here's species A. This is the riparian cover percentage that it particularly likes. Here's species B. This is the range that it particularly likes. Where they overlap, that could be our potential restoration target. And these are benthic macroinvertebrate families identified as important indicators for a specific site. So this is one way that we can use PHAB to set restoration goals. So thank you guys so much, and I'll take any questions if I have time.
We have one question.
Great.
And Rachel, you'll be around the rest of the day?
Yes.
And you're coming to the SFS?
No, I'm sorry. I live in Truckee. I have to beat the snow.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much.